Welcome to the Story Lab. Today we are going to take a look at the newer Star Trek series. Specifically, those are Star Trek Discovery, Picard, Prodigy, and Strange New Worlds. Now, why do we look at those all at once? Because they claim to be all in the same universe, yet they constantly contradict not only the previous installments in that universe, but also each other and sometimes themselves internally. In the long run, we think, everyone has to admit that these series cannot stay in the same timeline as everything else that has come in Star Trek before. Thus, today we will cook up a timelines-fixing story for Star Trek. Specifically, we're going to create one story that should fix the Discovery, Picard, Prodigy etc. continuity issues, and maybe even some of their questionable moments in one new great timeline, giving each of the existing stories a place to stay. But let's clarify, what is the goal here? We aim to construct a story that cancels out mere events from Picard and Discovery and Strange New Worlds, without simply making those stories meaningless. A story that capsules off Prodigy, the Kelvin Universe movies, later seasons of Discovery etc. so that they are further developed, without interfering with canon. A story that more closely aligns Strange New Worlds with the original series, while also explaining the current moments of Strange New Worlds already being more closely aligned to the original series, compared to Discovery, and especially for a show set in Discovery time. And of course, we wish the story to be engaging overall, building on story beats and introducing new ones at same time, so not just an off-screen or exposition change. Let's put together some ingredients for the story. It must be a time travel story that will at some point allow a split between the canon universe and the, let's call it, Discovery universe. The temporal war, or some variation of it, will allow multiple timelines to exist and the actions in them to have significant meaning, so that's certainly a good start. The split has to occur before the start of Discovery, hence time travel to the past will be part of the story. There is still an unexplored timeframe around either the eugenics wars or the Third World War, which we nonetheless recognize immediately thanks to certain prominent figures, Khan, Colonel Green. The story has to explain why the timeline fixing has to occur, and why the crew of Strange New Worlds would be okay with that. And there is more. There are some key events in the history of the entire galaxy that have to be explained, such as the Romulan supernova, and the Klingon War etc. If possible, it should address the appearance changes of Klingons between Enterprise, Discovery, the original series, and later Klingons. The story is not about retconning the existing seasons of Discovery and Picard, but about reframing their presence in the canon timeline. With so many ingredients, we might need a deeper analysis. As it stands, Strange New Worlds is the only show that could reasonably be considered part of the normal canon, if it is divorced from Discovery. Both Strange New Worlds and Picard have already dealt with time travel. It would be nice to have a story integrating Strange New Worlds and/or Picard, the third season, fully into the canon timeline by the end. A good character to work with might be T'Kuvma, the leader of the Klingons or Klingoks in the first season of Star Trek Discovery. He is largely a blank slate figure, in terms of how he got such power, while also clearly being very influential and thus having the opportunity to change the timeline significantly. Working with T'Kuvma as a main villain would be a bit like how in Star Wars The New Jedi Order, the previously nondescript character Nom Anna was turned into part of the main villains for the new book series. So, after these thoughts, we have even more ingredients. Let's quickly go through them. The story shall be a Strange New World story. Allows to bring Strange New Worlds closer to the original series and fixing the other stories by proxy. This will not be a standalone story, but change the timeline wherein Strange New Worlds takes place. T'Kuvma is revealed to be a time traveler. He manipulated the Klingons into the Klingon War and maybe even changed their look. We'll let that cook for a while, and while that is working, let's remind ourselves of the golden rule for this experiment. It is allowed to remove stories, events, or entire series from canon, but not to make them meaningless. Everything that happens should have an impact in one way or another. Okay, seems as if we have the story ready. Let's take a look. The story begins on the USS Enterprise, Strange New Worlds. They are investigating a strange energy reading that seems to be following the Enterprise since quite a while. They realize that it is a ship with a failing cloaking device. After a while, the cloak fully dissipates and they see that the ship has been heavily damaged by an ion storm. They send a rescue team and find that the people on board are from the Federation. The damaged ship breaks apart and so they take the people on board. When they wake up, they initially do not want to talk, but in the end are convinced that they have no choice but to reveal who they are. Temporal agents from the 32nd century. As it turns out, there is a group of temporal terrorists on the loose, people who travel to key events in time and fundamentally change them, causing unpredictable new timelines to occur. The temporal agents have been following one such terrorist called T'Kuvma to the past. T'Kuvma's terrorist act had been to cause the Romulan supernova in the late 24th century. While the temporal agents had fixed that timeline, thus preventing the Kelvin universe, T'Kuvma had fled further into the past to an unknown timeframe, causing further complications. The temporal agents had been unable to follow T'Kuvma because the people in the changed 25th century, i.e. during the events of Star Trek Picard's first and second season, had further timeline adventures, Picard Season 2, that destabilized all the timelines, which explains the seeming continuity changes between seasons of Picard. When the temporal agents had finally fixed it, to Picard Season 3, T'Kuvma had already disappeared into history and caused further changes, preventing temporal scanners from determining where he went to. The temporal agents had found T'Kuvma in the 23rd century, where of course he was killed by Michael Burnham, starting the Klingon War. The temporal agents had been pretty sure that T'Kuvma had gone even further back in time, causing various changes. The agents wanted to search in the 20th century, but they had been confused by the Enterprise. They explain that the timeline for some reason seems to be realigning itself with the known future around the Enterprise, even though it existed in the changed timeline. It was while investigating this discrepancy that the temporal agents had lost their ship. The temporal agents also explain that while the new timeline is already developing beyond their year of origin, in Star Trek Discovery Seasons 3 to 5, that is, a great catastrophe, the burn, would come over the galaxy in that timeline, that they would wish to avert. Hearing all of that, the crew of the Enterprise decides to help catch T'Kuvma in the past. A time-traveling heist begins, where the Enterprise along with the temporal agents returns to the time of the Augment Wars to search for T'Kuvma. They find him on Earth, trying to build an army that would be powerful enough for him to safely return to the future. The crew foils his plan, but T'Kuvma escapes off-world. The crew follows him further to the future and discovers that T'Kuvma is now on Kronos, influencing the development of the Klingons. Having offered the Klingons a cure for the Augment virus, T'Kuvma had manipulated the Klingons into looking like himself, which would eventually allow him to claim to be Klingon as well. This time, however, the crew of the Enterprise can stop him. It seems that everything is adverted, but there is still a problem. Because the Enterprise crew had been the ones doing all the time travel and timeline fixing, now that the timeline realigns, the crew retains all the memories from the previous timeline, even though the changes occurred quite a while before they had been born. The temporal agents explain that normally their memories would simply be overwritten, which is usually unproblematic, simply causing a déjà vu or sometimes changing when a certain promotion would occur. But now the crew of the Enterprise would have to live with two sets of memory, one from the T'Kuvma timeline and one from the now re-established timeline. The crew accepts this fate and continues on his travels, while the temporal agents return to the future with the captured T'Kuvma using the temporal terrorists' time ship. That's the end of the story. Let's summarize what has happened. In the story, the crew of the Strange New Worlds Enterprise helps temporal agents from the future to re-establish the canon timeline by capturing a temporal terrorist. This terrorist had caused the Romulan supernova and managed to escape, because there had been several time travel events in the 25th century. The temporal agents had been unable to follow T'Kuvma to the past, and he already affected the timeline further by the time the agents had fixed the 25th century. This explains all of the events' contradictions between seasons of Star Trek Picard. The crew then agrees to help capturing T'Kuvma and manages to do so, while discovering how T'Kuvma had changed the timeline during the Eugenics Wars and the Klingon development. Because of their help in capturing Tikuvma, the Enterprise's crew now has double memory in their heads, making both the events of the old and the new timeline a reality to them. So, did we reach our goal? We wanted a story that cancels out major events from Picard and Discovery, and Strange New Worlds, without simply making those stories meaningless, and a story that capsules off Prodigy, the Kelvin Universe movies, later seasons of Discovery etc. so that they are further developed, without interfering with canon. And yes, with our story, these series are in different timelines, but the events of Picard influence the hunt for Tikuvma, and the events of Discovery are retained in the minds of the Strange New Worlds crew. We also aimed for a story that more closely aligned Strange New Worlds with the original series, while also explaining the current more closely aligned things for a show set in Discovery time. And yes, in the timeline-fixing story, Strange New Worlds had weirdly started to realign with the canon again, because they were the ones that would eventually fix everything, but only fully became part of the canon at the end of the story. Well then, seems like our story experiment was a success. Please note that everything presented here is simply the results of an experiment. No part of this presentation is intended as a correction of an existing story or claims to be the real story. The selection or omission of any parts of the source material is not to be understood as commentary, positive or negative, on the original productions. These are simply thoughts and experiments based on existing material, and none of it could be created without the work of all those involved in creating the original works. As with any scientific result, you may utilize any of the story ideas that resulted from these experiments for your own experiments or production, while citing this experiment as its source. It is now closing time for our lab. Goodbye until next time.